Good morning and welcome to a discussion on CHIPCO movement. Today's discussion relates to our MA program in Gandhi and Peace Studies and also the postgraduate certificate program in Gandhi and Peace Studies. It specifically focuses on Gandhian concern on environment. CHIPCO is one of those movements that widely focused and founded on Gandhian philosophy, Gandhian foundation of social concern and also strategy of collective initiative. Gandhi from the very beginning was widely concerned about environment. His environmental concern was reflected specifically his view on a self-centered, rather self-sufficient village community system of development. By doing so, he developed a kind of attitude, a kind of thinking against industrialization. He thought that it was the industrialization, specifically Western industrialization, that has brought in a huge quantum of consumerism, a huge quantum of pollution, huge quantum of excess use of natural resources that has brought in a distraction and devastation for the natural habitat. Today, when we talk about environmental issues, we have to talk about Gandhian concern, how he has brought in his concern about environment. Gandhi is now being considered as one of the earliest environmentalists, especially since the onset of the CHIPCO movement in the Garhwal Himalayan region. His concern has primarily centered on the Western model of development and its negative implication in the country like India. When we are talking about industrialization, as I was talking a few seconds earlier, that is, he was widely concerned that when the industrialization comes in, it gradually encroaches the intrinsic relationship between the nature and human being, the human requirement and also natural regeneration. In the process of this regeneration, it is the nature that gets the maximum onslaught. Ultimately, there is a process of what we call destruction of the environment, destruction of the natural habitat. Gandhi expected a balanced approach. In doing so, balanced approach, a kind of a concerted relationship, a balanced relationship, the human being and the society. And CHIPCO movement is one of those movements. They widely talked about the preservation of the nature, and simultaneously it talks about a kind of a intrinsic, rebuilding the intrinsic relationship between the human being and the nature. When you talk about Gandhian model of development, as you will be aware that Gandhi was trying to make a synchronization between the human being and the nature, and it is founded on his self-sufficient village community system of production that is totally founded on khadi and charkha and also on the household industry. Gandhi was not against industrialization. He was in favor of industrialization founded on the indigenous knowledge, founded on the traditional industry, founded on the charkha. That was the very foundation of a self-sufficient system of economy and social being and becoming. In Gandhian paradigm, respect for the nature is as intrinsic as the respect for the diverse tradition, culture, patterns of community living and of the livelihood. Gandhi's preference for traditional way of life endowed with natural nature, air, water, sunshine, and also he was having enormous dislike for this urban way of life that was totally bringing a lot of devastation for the clean air, for the water, clean sunshine, all those kind of a thing. By speaking, he widely spoke about the voluntary reduction of one's desire by voluntarily reducing one desire, one can contribute towards the sustenance of environment. Once Gandhiji famously wrote, that is, it is the mother nature that is having everything to give to all human beings on this earth. So what it talks about, mother nature is having everything to suffice your need, but not your greed. It is the industrialization and the Western civilization that has inculcated a kind of consumerism that has been the breeding point of new kind of need in the society. To suffice that need, varieties of onslaught, varieties of attacks are made on the environment. Ultimately, there has been a kind of a destruction of the forest, water and the other natural resources. And Gandhiji widely talked about all those things in his constructive work that was published in 1948. He widely talked about how the society to be regenerated and what kind of constructive work to be taken for each and every segment of the society, and through that constructive work a kind of balanced relationship between nature and human being can be evolved. However, the way we talk about Gandhian philosophy, it has been widely talked about that since second 5-year plan onward, there was enormous emphasis on heavy industrialization, rapid industrialization, rapid modernization, and in the process, Gandhian philosophy occupied a backseat within the developmental discourse of Indian society. As the industrialization has advanced to the in the world, not only in the Western world, but also in the rest of the developing world, there has been a kind of onslaught that Robert Beck, one of the famous sociologists, Ulrich Beck, one of the sociologists, he widely talked about the development of a risk society. By talking about risk society, he was talking a kind of a reflexive modernization where the unintended and unforeseen side effect of modernization that is the backfire that has backfired on the modernity. When we talked about modernity, we talked about a kind of rationality, kind of new social order that will bring inequality, that will eliminate inequality, that will bring a kind of equality in the society, which will be, because it will be guided by a sense of rationality, calculation, predictability, a kind of a human moral driven environment. But ultimately, modernity got accompanied by industrialization. In the process, many noble ideas of modernity got sidelined. Ultimately, what we find is there has been varieties of catastrophes in terms of those are the product of modernity. Take into consideration the issue of atom bomb, the atomic research, etc. like this. The way it is Chernobyl, the Russian phenomenon that brought a disaster on the society. Similarly, we find that the Bhopal tragedy, that was also because of one of the reflection of advancement of modernity. So what has happened? The industrialization and modernization brought a series of destruction in the society. In the process, it has brought pollution in the air, in the soil, on the earth, on the water, and also ultimately there have been this a kind of it has attacked also the ozone layer, and ultimately we experience enormous proliferation of CO2 and the process of climate change that has brought drought, that has brought heavy rainfall and flood many parts of the world. The way nature was already having its own kind of timing, own kind of seasoning that is getting delayed or advanced and bringing varieties of anomalies in the behavior of the nature. And those anomalies in the natural behavior are widely talked about. These are anthropogenic, that is, those are created by human beings themselves. What we find that when there was an onslaught on the part of the nature, there is enormous development in one part of the world. Simultaneously, we find persistent inequality and underdevelopment in another part of the world, and also enormous inequality on the one hand, prosperity on the other, and those are created at the cost of imbalances in the society. And those brought in a varieties of new consciousness in the society that created new social movement, especially starting from early 1960s onward. So what we find, a new kind of collectivities are in the making. Those collectivities are expressing a new kind of concern, and many of the concern went beyond the economic concern. They are concerned about the human rights, concerned about the environment, concerned about the women's right, concerned about the rights of the animal, gay and other communities. So what you find, the new kind of communities are in the making, a new kind of a concern came in, and what we find, many of the local issues started getting defined globally, a kind of a connectivity, local global connectivity started taking place. The way these are described, a kind of planetarianization of the concern, and within this planetarianization of the concern, we find that is social movement and the new consciousness was, there was arousal of the new consciousness. Those are not guided by immediate economic aspiration, rather those are guided by enormous sense of subjectivity, concern for the fellow human being, concern for the environment, concern for the animal and other stakeholders of the society. So that concern created a new kind of autonomy in the society, that autonomy asking for a space, that space or carved out by those new collectivities, the global collectivities and the global concern, and those concerns are expressed following the Gandhian path of non-violence. That is a non-violence, a moral and a subjective concern with a global community were formed that paved the foundation of new consciousness and new social movement in the society. And what you talk about the modern environmental movement that is taking place in the West, and gradually it has also come in India, but social concern of India about environment is as old as the industrialization, as old as Gandhi's interpenetration with the engagement with the independent movement. So what you find that new social movement and the new identity which you are talking about, those are already there in the society, but those got widely re-articulated and reinforced in the starting from early 1960s, and environmental movement is so one of that movement that talks about the new social movement and formation of the new identities. So what we find, a process that started from early 1960s got widely articulated globally from 70s onward. The 1970s saw the environmental issues coming to the international forum with the Stockholm Conference being one of the pioneering convention on the issue of environment. India, being one of the member of the United Nations, also committed itself to the major commitment of this convention. And the environmental movement in India have seen more or less conducted, those who are conducted at the grassroots, they also got wide interlinked with the national and the regional scenario. There have been initially, these are initially characterized by the protest against the companies, that is the multinational companies, those indiscriminately using the forest resources, the commercial product for their commercial purposes. Later those movement got focused on the issue of water, on the forest, on the biodiversity, and on the issue of massive deforestation and pollution of the water bodies and the other resources. As against this backdrop, we find there is the emergence of Chipko movement or the Chipko Andolan that spearheaded the environmental concern and environmental movement in the country. The Chipko movement, which is also widely characterized as a part of the women's movement, because this movement was spearheaded by women. It started in the Uttarakhand state, Garhwal Himalayas and Uttarakhand state. This region is widely known for its fragile ecology, often prone to the earthquake, soil erosion, and varieties of the other kind of a problem. This what we find that when this fragile situation was already there, there was also large scale migration of the male folk from the rural to the urban areas in search of employment. And then we find it was seen that Garhwali women, they came to the forefront for the maintenance of the household to provide the economic support. So they are moving, they are widely dependent on the forest resources for their livelihood security, for the fodder, for the fuel, for the food and other kind of subsistence for the family. When this gradual need gradually emerged, more dependency on the forest. On the other hand, there was large scale commercial felling of the forest by the government contractors, and they started destroying the forest. And when they started destroying the forest, that brought another kind of big challenges to the economy and livelihood security of the local people, and that realization of the livelihood security were really widely realized by the women of the Garhwal Hill. With the denouncing and declining of the forest resources, what they found, a kind of a change was taking place in the society, because forest was gradually appearing, and a devastating flood, landsliding, slide, etc., and also simultaneously low productivity from the land, etc., become a phenomenon. People started becoming aware of this scenario. But as a student of social movement and Gandhian studies, you will have to understand that none of the movements are taken place alone on one day. The movements are the product of varieties of interaction and varieties of engagement with varieties of personalities, both from within and outside. The Garhwal Hill has been one of the areas that has attracted the attention of many of the Gandhians to make their engagement with the issues of the Garhwal Hills. Mira Bhen, one of the disciples of Mahatma Gandhi, he moved to Himalayan region in late 1940s, and there he started organizing the rural women for the protection of the cattle, for the preservation of the forest resources. And what she observed that gradually there was the penetration of the market forces in that area, and the eco-friendly bunch tree, that tree was gradually replaced with the commercial kind of a pine trees cultivation in this area. So what she started doing at that point, started explaining the demerits of deforestation and water logging and the soil erosion among the villagers. Also, she started talking with them how the private enterprises are exploiting the local resources and how they are carrying out their own kind of program, means the commercial exploiter of the forest, to get a quick returns out of this deforestation. Similarly, there was also another personality, Sarala Bhen. She was also a Gandhian. She also walked into the Kumaon region. She started organizing the rural women on the same issue, and she created environmental awareness among those people. And she formed an organization, Uttaranchal Sarvadaya Mandal. There she organized the people and make the people aware about the importance of the forest and the forest resources. And gradually we find a good number of the women, guided by Gandhian philosophy, came together, like Mira Bhen, Sarala Bhen, Bimla Bhen, Hima Devi, Gauri Devi, Ganga Devi. So many other names they got associated with this organization, and they talked about the Gram Saras Sangh, and ultimately their focus got diverted towards the preservation of the forest. At the time when this movement was gradually brewing, gradually people started talking about the forest problem of deforestation. Sundar Lal Bahuguna, the face of this movement, he also came to the forefront. He got closely associated with Mira Bhen and Sarala Bhen, inherited their legacy, and started giving necessary guideline and necessary guidance to the local people for the protection of the forest. And at the time, there was a combined kind of efforts, concept started coming in. First, what is important that the people are to be make aware, people are to be aware of the situation. So a conceptualization of this local problem, the philosophical and the conceptual articulation of the environmental on the environmental issues started taking place. Those are already given by Meera Behen and Sundarlal Bahuguna. Similarly, the organizational foundation, women came forward under the leadership of Sarala Bhen, Bimla Bhen in the Garhwal region and also Kumaon region, and they formed their own kind of association. And Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and many others, they played a crucial role in mobilizing the people, in giving the leadership and making the people aware and to make them mobilize against the felling of tree, and also simultaneously towards their livelihood security. So gradually what happened, a kind of a new consciousness arose that kind of embraced the tree, the hug the tree and saved them from being felled, and the prosperity of the hill is dependent on protection of the forest. So these are kind of a message that started going in, the hug the tree and the save the tree. It became a part of everyday kind of activities of those mobilizers. One of the key events took place in 1973, with around 300 trees are fallen in one day, and people started apprehending a more kind of attack on the forest resources. So they started gathering together, and a 75-year-old woman, Shyama Devi, she came forward and she started hugging the tree. And the hugging the tree, which was initially started with a person, Bhim Singh Negi, that was the first hugging of the tree. That was widely replicated by Shyama Devi, that 75-year-old woman. She hugged the tree, she disallowed, rather prevented the forester to come inside the forest and cut the tree. So that message went across the Garhwal Hill, and people started talking about, started feeling about, and gradually mobilizing more and more people towards the hugging the tree and protecting the forest. It became a kind of a multiplier impact on the society. In one of such occasions, sensing the absence of the men, because men were coming to the cities for the job. So for the contractors, they again entered the forest, because men folk are not there. They may easily enter into the forest. But they found that women, they have organized themselves to protect the tree and to hug the tree, and under their everyday surveillance, they prevented those government contractors and the laborers from cutting the tree. So what we find, those movements initially were led by Gauri Devi and Ganga Devi and their co-workers, and it became so successful that government contractors went away, and consequently the government imposed a ban on the commercial cutting of the tree, green tree in that region. That success of this movement, the first success of the movement, people tested with the government or compelled to make a resolution, pass a law banning cutting the green tree in those areas. Gradually this movement got momentum. This incident gave the movement a further momentum to mobilize all the villagers in the region to protect against the commercial felling of the tree. Women at times they worked in the far areas about 75 days, appealing the people to protect the forest. This movement consequently became successful, and also a Advani Satyagraha, it took place following the Gandhian model. The women took part in that Satyagraha, and that became a large-scale success against that felling of the tree, and the Chupko movement got another new momentum. What is important that this movement was basically non-violent. Chipko activists found an effective means or conduct in the environmental movement, because it is through the non-violent movement they save the people from police atrocities, the attack of the government contractors. That is one. Second important part is that this was also widely resurgence of women's power, that the women themselves can organize a movement, lead a movement and protect the forest. So that became one of the vivid example in that area. So it brought into light the burning issue of judicious natural resources, which in long run benefit the humankind, and through it, there will be a process of regeneration of the earth. So what we find, the Chupko movement, which was started initially in early 1970s, gradually spread across the Kumaon and the Garhwal Hill region for the protection of this forest. An important part of this movement is that this movement was also replicated in other parts of the country. For example, women of Chhattisgarh, they started talking about the Jal, Jameen, Jameen and Jungle, how those are to be protected. Women came to the forefront. They also followed the Gandhian path of non-violence. So what we find, a movement which was started with the success of Gandhian model, it got replicated in many parts of the country. Thank you.